Right. Okay, we are recording now, and I will present the text so that you can take a look at the poems while we discuss them. Is my screen now visible?
Yes, sir.
Right. So the first, or rather, we'll discuss 4 poems. So the first poem that I'd like to discuss is taken from the collection titled The Black Hen. This obviously was published posthumously after Ramanujan passed away. And The Black Hen marks a departure from Ramanujan's other texts in the sense that it is almost obsessively engaged with the theme of death and self-reflexivity. So pain, death, self-reflexivity, memory, these are all themes that the Black Hen is majorly engaged with. And therefore, this is a poem that immediately talks about the art of writing poetry. And the Black Hen, once again, foregrounds Ramanujan's technique of the dominant and very urgent image, which is at the center of the text, which I've been talking about a little bit. And I will also do this through Ramanujan's other interviews and quotations when we discuss another segment of Ramanujan's art or poetic technique later on. But it begins with, it must come as leaves to a tree or not at all. Now, you can, of course, sense that there is this entire notion about how poetry arrives, right? Or how poetry is crafted. So this poem really is about the self-reflexivity of the poet. And you are all aware of the 2 traditions of poetic craft, right? One that believes in inspiration, that starts right away from Plato's iron, moves through Kidman, and then comes through to the Romantics to us. Within this thesis, the poet is a specialized or a more sensitive kind of an individual. That poetry does not, is not a craft really, but an inspiration, and therefore it is something that does not require intervention by the poet's technique. It comes naturally. It must come as leaves to a tree or not at all. So just as leaves come to a tree, therefore poetry must arrive. So the poet is, as it were, the more sensitive soul to whom poetry occurs almost instinctively. This is one of the theses that is offered. The other thesis that is offered is that poetics and poetry is a very well organized craft. And you will remember your study of Horace's Ars Poetica, where Horace talks about a poem needing techne or technique, very detailed attention to the crafting of words. And Horace, in fact, advises the poet to keep his poem for 9 years before publishing it. And you have this entire discourse of poetic self-reflexive awareness of the craft of poetry, culminating somewhere in Yeats's notion, which brings together these 2 ideas, that a poem must, it must take a long time. It must engage the poet's entire craft. But if it does not appear to be a moment's thought, then it is not a valid poem. So Yeats, as it were, tries to bridge these 2 ideas. One, that poetry is a very significant craft, and the poet has to engage with words to craft a particular image and a text that must seem spontaneous. So Ramanujan begins with that premise, and you can see what happens is the juxtaposition, as it were, between the Black Hen, and which is a very favorite and almost a familiar trope for us Indians, isn't it? The hen is a symbol of, in a certain way, vitality. The black hen is a symbol of vitality, commonplace vitality. And the black hen, remember, in the southern states is also used in cockfights. So there's a sense of what you can call vital maleness about it, and it must come as leaves to a tree or not at all, right? So poetry, Ramanujan suggests, and begins ironically, not in a sense very transparently. How does poetry arrive? What vital aspects of the poet does poetry derive from, right? So the black hen becomes, once again, a metonymic representation of the creation of the poem. Yet it comes sometimes as the black hen. So that yet is the operative word, right? And you see, of course, once again, you'll have to acknowledge that at this point, Ramanujan is approaching the fag end of his life, is conscious of a nervous pain that is debilitating him. Many of his poems were, in fact, written in the shadow of pain and death. And therefore, it comes sometimes, the black hen is also, in a certain sense, like death in its urgency, in its finality, right? So yet it comes. So the term yet suggests that the first thesis that Ramanujan has suggested, that it must come as leaves to a tree or not at all, is contested. That it comes sometimes as the black hen with a round red eye. You see the urgency of that image once again, the foregrounding of the black hen with a round red eye on the embroidery. So obviously this is the crafting of the image of the black hen on the embroidery. And you see, we have used, and I have used this time and again, because Ramanujan uses this metaphor of poetry as stitching and unstitching with words. So embroidery is a recurrent motif in the self-reflexivity of Ramanujan's poetry. So on the embroidery, stitch by stitch, dropped and found again. Now, if you look at Ramanujan's interviews about how he composed poetry, he suggests that he wrote on scraps of paper and continually kept on revising them. In fact, there's a very famous quotation by Ramanujan where he says a poem is never completed. It is only abandoned, right? So this is the suggestion that the poetic craft, with its economy of words, as in Ramanujan's poetry, is a very deliberate and intricate craft that the poet continuously engages with words until the image is perfected. So on the embroidery, stitch by stitch, dropped and found again. And when it's all there, the black hen stares with its round eye. So when it's all finished, the poem and the poetic image, as it were, stares at us. So instead of us gazing at the poem is also gazing at the poet. You know, we have this idea that through poetry we can gaze into the soul of the poet. But is reading poetry only a one-way process? Does the poet also, through his poems, confront us with our deepest fears, our deepest anxieties, and in many cases, the black truths that we have to face, right? So does it make the reader confront with his inadequacies, his sense of incompleteness? And does the poem also, in the case of Ramanujan, make him aware of his pain and the impending death that he will undergo? So poetry is not something which is only beautiful or romantic, but the poem makes us confront our society's superstitions, our actions and inactions, our fears and anxieties, and also our limited mortality, right? Our mortalities that the poem confronts us with. And you are afraid. So while this is a poem which is very complex in the sense that it involves within its ambit the poet, the reader, and the poem. So the poem is not really a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, as Ramanujan ironically points out. It brings within itself the persona of the poet, his rigorous stitching and unstitching with words. And once the poem is complete, it seems to take on a life of its own. The image seems to haunt the poet, reminding him of his mortality and of his anxieties, of the nightmares, of the subconscious that has gone into the making of the poem. And it confronts the reader into facing his inadequacies. Now, obviously, you will immediately sort of try and question this. How does this happen? I'll give you a poem where this happens in a moment. So just hang on for a moment. But what Ramanujan's poem, The Black Hen, therefore suggests is, one, the process of poetry is complex and not necessarily spontaneous. Two, that poetry is a craft that is to be rigorously practiced and something that engages the poet in a very, very meticulous way. It's a process of pain and giving birth. Thirdly, that once the poem is made, or once the poem is abandoned, it gets a life of its own, whereby the image becomes, through the words, a vibrating, pulsating presence. And that presence is not necessarily beautiful. Ramanujan suggests that the best poems are ones which bring us face to face with our mortality, our anxieties, our inadequacies. And in many cases, therefore, not only is the audience fearful of the poem, but also the poet about the kind of creativity that he has done. May I remind you, of course, here of the poem, therefore, as a kind of a Frankenstein, a kind of a creation which has escaped from the power of the maker and gained a life of its own. A poem that can destroy, a poem that can frighten, a poem that can poem that can bear or touch your deepest anxieties, nightmares, and emotions. So this is a poet who is confronting his death, writing his final poems, and realizing in the process that the craft of poetry is not necessarily a romantic, lighted craft, but also almost like sorcery, a deep, dark craft, right? So this self-reflexivity talks about the darkness of poetry, its engagement with the darkness of death, the darkness of pain, and therefore its impact on both the poet and the reader, right? So that's an enigmatic poem, as I will say. And let me come back to I'll come back to this theme of death. But since I mentioned that, I'll give you a poem which brings us face to face with our inadequacies, our fears, and our impotencies. I will bring you to this poem titled As Eichmann Said and My Brother Said. Right. Now, this is a very, very Puram poem in that sense of the term, because it deals with public history. And Ramanujan has these poems which specifically deal with public history of his times. Right. I could have taken the Bosnia poem also. You'll find Ramanujan's poems on the genocide in Bosnia. But I thought that the Bosnia poem was rather well known, so I brought this poem up, which talks about Eichmann, who was known to be the keeper of the concentration camps. Eichmann was one of Hitler's major aides who organized the Holocaust and who was in charge of sending Jews to these concentration camps. And if you have seen Schindler's List and poems and read about the Holocaust, you would have seen how Eichmann's process involved identification of the Jew, marking his house with a yellow cross, cornering them, gathering them, transporting them, putting them in concentration camps, robbing them, extracting out their golden teeth, whatever riches that they had, killing them by the gas chamber, piled upon one another, a suffocating, horrendous death. Very often, other Jews were made to dig their graves, and they were shot and put in those graves themselves. So the darkest chapter in human history, the depravity that man could have done to man. Now, Eichmann, when the Third Reich collapsed, fled with a false passport to Argentina. Right. Now, it's also very interesting that in this process, many of Hitler's accomplices, the Nazis, were helped by the Roman Catholic Church, especially the Pope. If you have the time, you can read about this Pope who facilitated the flight of the Nazis. This very important book is titled Hitler's Pope. You'll find it on the internet. Hitler's Pope. And many of them, they changed their identities, took on new identities, and settled in Southern America, especially Argentina. And Eichmann, who was the butcher of Hitler, who was known as the butcher of Hitler, settled in South America, in Argentina. Well, once the state of Israel was born, it was mandated by the Prime Minister of Israel to hunt down the perpetrators of the Holocaust and bring them to justice. Accordingly, the Jews tracked Eichmann down and kidnapped him from Argentina and brought him to trial at Israel. Now, during this trial, of course, Eichmann made a few statements. And this becomes the book, or rather the basis, for one of the most important philosophical books of our period. And that is Hannah Arendt's book, which talks about the banality of evil. Banality is B-A-N-A-L-I-T-Y, the banality of evil. What is banality? Banality is the commonplace. Now, what was Eichmann's defense? Eichmann said that he did nothing out of his own volition. He was simply a loyal subject of the state, following the orders that were given to him, just like other people were following orders. So we have this concept of the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt writes about, that it was true that a lot of common people in Germany and France were aware of the fate of the Jews, were aware of the monstrous nature of the injustice handed over to them. Yet they went on with their practices, suggesting that nothing had happened, or in many cases turned collaborator for the fear of their own lives. So willy-nilly, Arendt says they were part of this banality of evil, so that when evil became so commonplace, that evil is accepted by the people at large as something that is natural, right? So the banality of evil argues, one, acceptance of the evil as the new normal. Secondly, not being bothered by it, not intervening by it, and suggesting or justifying this in the sense that one is bound to follow the dictates of the state. Now, Eichmann was, of course, sentenced to death, but his trial and his defense of the banality of evil created a new corpus of ideas and philosophies about what and how people react to the notion of evil. Now, just think about it in a larger context. Many of us too take a lot of things which we would have protested against because we have our jobs to protect, or we have our comfortable lives to protect, or we have our interests to safeguard, and we accept certain phenomena which we know are immoral as part and parcel of our life. We do not protest. We do not come out in numbers to resist it. Now, this is the background of Ramanujan's poem. Now, you will also have seen that around this time, India was, and Ramanujan's two major, Puram poems, public poems, were about the genocide that the Bosnians created on another ethnicity. And also in India, in the 70s, in the late 70s, when the emergency was clamped down and the people accepted the emergency, and the suspension of democratic rights as something that was pretty natural in the cause of the state. Now, therefore, when you read this poem, you have to read it in three ways. One is that it talks about Eichmann and the defense of Eichmann, about the fact that he was forced to carry on, or he was merely carrying out the order of the state. Two, that you can read it about, in reality, the Indian condition of the emergency, where the suspension of fundamental rights and democracy was accepted by the vast majority of people without any protest or resistance. And you can read this as a poem about the banality of evil, that very often this is the case when great injustice is perpetrated and almost normalized, made normative, that people accept it as something which is the new normal. And therefore, it's a poem that makes you confront yourself, take a look at yourself, and see whether you too are part of the banality of this evil. So this is a poem that could make you afraid. We talked about the Black Hen earlier. And this is also a poem which makes us afraid. As Eichmann said, the trains ran like a dream, my brother said. So once again, a refrain of the people who underwent the emergency was that everything was spick and span, that trains ran on time, that people came to work on time, that people were afraid, and therefore everything was well with the state. So there are two times here. One is the Eichmannian time and the Holocaust, and the other is the brothers' time that is the emergency. So when Eichmann said, the trains ran like a dream, my brother said, in the city square and the stocks were harem-ping bulls on TV, towards mountains of spectacles that had lost their eyes. This is the reference to the Jews who were, herded into trains, and goods trains rather, like cattle, and their spectacles were taken out, their hair was shaved, and their golden teeth were extracted. So a mountain of spectacles without eyes, because the eyes were all sent to the gas chamber, right? So therefore, spectacles, which are symbols of vision, are in reality the symbols of greatest darkness and a reminder of the evil. Gold teeth without faces. Once again, teeth were extracted, the golden teeth, so that it could add to the Nazi coffers. Artificial limbs climbing by themselves all over the landscape. Junk bonds lying in the graveyard of cars and caterpillars. Right, so human life reduced to junk, human life reduced to waste. All along the train tracks, and you see, once again, why is this train important? Because the brother has said that trains are running on time during the emergency. All along the train tracks, as Eichmann said, I obeyed, that's all. I obeyed orders, that's all. That's Eichmann's defense, that he was merely obeying the orders of the state. I obeyed orders, that all. My brother said, right? So, you see, what is here suggested is that the banality of evil is something that is spread over time. It existed when Eichmann was there. It existed when the emergency was there. And it will exist when other forms of the suspension of democracy and the clear violation of human rights take place. So the banality of evil and the cyclicity of the banality of evil is the subject matter of the poem. So Ramanujan is forcing us to confront that rather than being the be-all and end-all of all being and the rational individual, human beings are very often like cattle. They are motivated by self-interest, self-preservation, and they turn a dark eye to evil. In the sense, it is a poem that makes the modern Indian confront his participation or his involvement within this practice of the banality of evil, just as it took place during the Holocaust. As pension crumbles and he herded people like himself into cattle cars, children like his own, right? Therefore, people, Jews who were just commonplace individuals being herded into cars and branded like cattle, into ovens, not unlike the ones in your kitchen. Now that's a devastating metaphor, isn't it? Right? That people were thrust into gas chambers, into ovens, where they became cooked meat, as in the way we cook meat in our kitchen. Only larger dying men making pyramids of tangled hands. Now, if you go to any of these concentration camps, God forbid you do not have to go there anytime and visit these camps. I personally have seen videos of them because I am interested in the Holocaust and the literature of the Holocaust. Now you'll see these are very stark, naked places, right? These are small rooms where people would be cramped and gases would come in through all the outlets, or the inlets rather, and there would be no outlet. So, people would be clamped upon one another, gasping for breath, trying to reach out to the windows, and these are windowless, I'm sorry. So therefore, the only ventilators that existed on the top of the entire room, so hands gasping for breath, really. So larger dying men making pyramids of the tangled hands and feet, fingers in another's eye, towards the air hole, the chimney, through which they all went up in smoke. And to to decimate the evidence. They were often burned in mass graves or burnt, and then their ashes were spread across the country. So you see how what Ramanujan is trying to suggest here is the evil, is the ultimate evil that men can do unto others, killing people, destroying their lives. And in many cases, the barbaric process of sterilization that the emergency also perpetrated on human beings. As Eichmann said, how can I talk about it now? After all these years, so Eichmann was captured almost 20 years after he had perpetrated these crimes. So how can I talk about it now? After all these years of not remembering and not forgetting either. That was then, now is now, my brother said. So the suggestion is that that was then. So the Holocaust has ended, that period of barbarity was over, now is now. But you see, what the poem suggests is then and now are not so very different, in the sense that the same banality of evil, that the same suspension of human rights, the same treatment of human beings as cattle and experimental fodder is perpetrated across societies time and time again, where people are marked out and sent to their death. If you followed the newspapers, you've seen how in Pakistan recently, in Quetta, the Hazaras were taken out of the bus, identified by their papers and shot dead, and the bodies piled upon one another. So the banality of evil, the identification, sectarian conflicts, religious conflicts go on, and we remain impervious to them, just as we remained impervious during the Holocaust. So we have talked about the Black Hen, and we have talked about a poem which is crafted and recrafted so that it can capture, in many cases, the urgency, the vibrancy, the starkness of the metaphor, in this case, the gas chamber. And it suddenly makes you afraid, because that image, that banality of evil, is also located within you. Now, that is a new philosophical concept that I've given to you. Do read Hannah Arendt, who was a journalist by profession and one of the most important philosophers of this time, and her description of the trial of Eichmann and the concept that I have initiated to you, the banality of evil. Now, I have talked at length about these two poems, but I'll sort of quickly move across two other last poems of Ramanujan, where Ramanujan talks about pain, and he was inflicted with nervous pain at this point of time. So there was a pain that radiated from his hip to his ankle, and he had to undergo surgery, during which he died. And therefore, Ramanujan is writing about, in the Black Hen, about this pain, about the nerve endings, and how within these, and how modern medicine is unable to relieve him of this pain. And he looks only at death and the memories of his mother, which can relieve him of this agony, as it were. Pains in my ankle flicker, nerve ends glower and dim like cigarette ends, in a chain smoker's mouth night and day. So the pervasive pain that refuses to go away. Doctors x-ray the foot, front, face and back, left profile and right, as if for a police file, unearth shadow fossils of Neanderthals. So the doctors are like almost geologists who are looking for fossils buried in this contemporary foot. They draw 3 test tubes of blood. So the medical tests and the processes that he has to undergo, as I turn my face away and label my essences. So you've seen your blood drawn and your name sort of put there. So essences, the hemoglobins and the corpuscles and the other identification marks of your blood, with a misspelled name put by body whole into a white tunnel MRI machine. if you've undergone the MRI process, where you're put into a kind of a chamber, as it were, and scanned with no light at the end, inject a green day glow light. Once again, the process is akin to the process where dyes are injected into the blood so that you can trace the blockages in the arteries and the veins. And at the end, inject a green day glow light to take pictures in dots of purple and sickly pink on a computer screen. So once again, note the urgency with which Ramanujan, the starkness with which Ramanujan suggests that the human pain is sought to be reduced onto pictures and points and abstractions on the test results. And therefore, the human being, rather than being a subject, becomes an object. And the pain is sought to be reduced to a phenomenon that can be identified and mapped. And yet the pain has a life of its own. And it is available. Now, those of you who have, all of us have undergone pain, physical pain. It's something that cannot be shared. That's something that cannot be expressed, transmuted into words, much as you would like to transmute it into physical results and tangible, reasons. That pain refuses to go away, and that pain cannot be experienced by doctors, cannot be experienced by others, and cannot be adequately described in terms of words. So Ramanujan is, as it were, searching for metaphors through which that pain can be explained in words. But there's always this lag, there's always this gap between the word and the experience that is explored here. Men and women of different races and sizes in white smocks look at the dots and shake their heads. Of different races, obviously, Ramanujan is here referring to America, where you have different doctors of different ethnicities looking at these dots and speculating over the nature of pain. Now, doctors were not sure about the exact nature of the cause of Ramanujan's pain. So this puzzlement, this inability to comprehend, and the inability to communicate are, as it were, superimposed. Comprehend by the doctors, communicate by the poet. So the poet is desperately trying to communicate his pain through words as a form of expiation, that if the pain can be communicated, it can be exorcised, it can be taken out. But he's failing. And the doctor is trying to understand the cause of the pain so that he can treat it, but failing. In the process, the human being, the poet persona, is the subject, or rather becomes the subject of the poem, becomes an object who is dissected either by words or by tests. The pain in the ankle glowers on, a red-hot coal pressed now and then against a nerve nobody can find, right? And in many ways, you see, this becomes also metanomic in the sense that this poem is about life also, and life as a series of crises and pain. If you've read, The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry, a text which was prescribed somewhere, sometime in your syllabus, you will have remembered O. Henry suggesting that human life is like, smiles and sobs and sniffles, and the latter predominating. So human life is about experiencing pain, be it physical pain, be it mental pain, be it the agony of people passing away, be it the agony of the body rotting away. So in a larger sense, the poetic subject broadens out into a dissection of human life as a source of continuous pain. The pain in the ankle glowers on, just as in the way pain glowers on in life, on a red-hot coal pressed now and then against a nerve nobody can find. So nobody can really be free of pain. Nobody can really be free of grief, of the intensity of pain. O God of knowledge, busy wizard of diagnosis, right? So therefore, this attempt to understand pain and the attempt to and the failure to resolve the reason. So Ramanujan is somewhere suggesting that human science, despite its attempts, have remained inadequate. So, O God of knowledge, busy wizard of diagnosis, father of needles, dials, and test tubes, send your old companion here, the mother of mothers, goddess though of ignorance. And here, Ramanujan goes back to the image of the mother, right, of the nursing mother of as it were, nature, which can cure through its empathy, right? So the mother whose presence, and in Ramanujan, this presence of the mother is a very strong presence, the mother whose sense of touch, whose sense of stories, whose presence, whose physical presence is, as it were, a reminder and a balm for him. So mother of mothers, goddesses though of ignorance. His mother, remember, was an ignorant woman, right? Nature is supposed to be ignorant rather than nurture. So that mother of mothers, goddess though of ignorance, send her soon so that she can kiss away my pain as she has always done. So it's instead of the science that sort of dissects his body, Ramanujan is looking for memory, looking for the presence of the absent presence of the dead mother, whose presence could have transformed this pain into peace. And therefore, once Ramanujan brings in this concept of memory, a memory that is painful, but yet it is within these memories that a freedom from the pain can occur. And if you take it in a larger sense, the mother of all mothers is death. And therefore, only death can come and take his pain away. So in a sense, these poems talk very urgently about the pained poet, the poet who undergoes physical pain, and then talks about the failure of human life to resolve pain and its return to the womb, to nature, or to the final peace, where, as in Hamlet, life's fitful favor over, he sleeps well. So these are poems which talk about suffering, aging, death. And let me therefore bring you to the final poem that I would like to discuss with you, is at zero. This is the moment at zero, being that magical number which is both the beginning and the end. And it's interesting in the sense that, from the traditional theological thought that Ramanujan would have schooled you, would have been schooled in, life is cyclical in the sense that there's this continual cycle of life and death. So that death is not just the end, but it's also a beginning. So clocks lose their tongues at zero. Zero is the moment where everything begins or ends, right? Ends is here in this case for Ramanujan, who was writing fervently about death at this point of time. Clocks lose their tongues, their hands fall off. Spider legs, pendulums sway no more. Scrotums of dead bulls, scrotums as in fertility, sexuality, which will no longer be valid. So it's a moment of an end. Clocks lose their tongues. They do not tick any longer. The hands fall off, right? Spider legs, pendulums sway no more. Scrotums of dead bulls, timepieces and wrists and towers lose time, right? So this is the moment when there's nothingness. Zero is that fascinating moment when there is nothingness, just like death. Blank Brahmin widow faces, once again the reference to the past of the death that brought in so many widow faces, Brahmin widow faces. through the wheels turn. So death, which has existed across generations and cultures, which has existed for these Brahmins, widows, for whom the moment of death of a near one would have spelt an eternal moment of suffering. The cogs catch at the center of the white, black, or coin face. The axle dot of metal turns continually. So the dial of the clock is the immediate image. But the Puram poem branches out into the frightening yet final moment of death. This is another poem that makes you afraid. The 12 numbers say nothing, untouched by any hand. Time circles, making no mark in space. So time circles, everything is obliterated, nothing remains. So the sands of time are washed away by time itself, once crammed with places and things. So it's as it were the space between the white space between the alphabets of the clocks are spaces of life, lives led once crammed with places and things. Right now, your laptops, my headphone, etc., crammed with things. And then one moment, and nothing exists. Places and things, red bricks in the mauve distance, waves with the trees, in the heat haze behind, a plane waiting for takeoff. So modernity, pre-modernity, life now, life then, all fills in these spaces. Yet when the moment of zero arrives, they vaporize. For takeoff, the eye looks, cannot see anything but currents of vapor, curling in the transparency. A journey, a plane that reminds you of a journey to nowhere. The ear listens, cannot hear a thing. Only the fingertip senses the movement of a balance wheel somewhere in there like a dove. You know, once again, the presence of, if you've read your Paradise Lost, of divinity, eternity like a dove, which exists silent, which is incomprehensible to man, and a balance wheel. And once again, here, the Christian and the Hindu, as it were, merge the balance wheel of karma, the balance wheel of eternity, which no word or which no human sensibility can comprehend. Pulsing, now faint, now clear in a blind man's hand at zero. As when the potter saint, singing hymns, dancing his God, kneaded with his feet of soft red clay, burying alive his youngest child. So, you know, it's also very importantly refers to the potter saint, as it were, the god of the potters, and the potter involved at continually making and unmaking out of clay shapes, while, you know, death can claim his youngest child. So life goes on, shapes are made. At the same time, zero is a presence in all our lives. That death is frighteningly real, that despite filling up these spaces, these white spaces, and cramming them with things, we are always faced with the death of our children, of ourselves, of the near and dear ones. So the Black Hen, in a certain sense, are dark poems which talk about the banality of evil, which talk about the cyclical patterns of time and the inevitability of death, that talks about the failure of words to transmute these human emotions or these inexplicable moments and experiences of pain and death into poetry. So this is a sequence of poems which are dark, which are self-reflexive in the sense that they try to comprehend how poetry comprehends life and death. And they acknowledge the banality of human nature. They acknowledge the powerlessness of the human. And they also acknowledge the powerlessness of poetic words to convey intense moments of pain and death, which are beyond words, as it were. So it is with these poems, this particular group of poems, that I will bring my discussion of Ramanujan's poetry to a close. I, of course, had approximately 600 poems of Ramanujan at my disposal, of which I chose 10. But what was the rationale of my choice? I wanted to give you poems from the three phases of, or the three major collections of Ramanujan's poetry. His initial poems of the Striders, his middle poems, and of course, the Black Hen, which was published posthumously. So the three stages of his life, as it were, as Ramanujan matures and as his themes change. Right, so I've talked about the way in which the interior and the exterior, the private and the public interact in Ramanujan, how individual experience, selfhoods become the center and the dominant images, and how from those central circles, there are concentric circles that radiate out to talk about more Puram themes of life, death, contemporary politics, of critiques of Hindu ways of existence, of how, Ramanujan interrogates an Indian modernity and its failure to sort of tether itself, or rather failure to drag itself out of from tradition, the stitchings and unstitchings of modernity and tradition, the stitchings and unstitchings of poetic craft, and the way in which poetry engages with life, ironically takes a look at it. If you look at these poems, for example, once again, the irony of the brother who is as banal to his evil as Eichmann was to his, and the irony with which Ramanujan suggests that modern medicine and modern tests have failed to ultimately cure the pain. It can offer only medicines as palliatives. It can never finally cure the body of pain. So the way in which Ramanujan looks ironically at life also urgently gives voice to the image and the emotion, and then talks about themes of the relationship of the self to society, the relationship of the form of the poem to its content, the failure of language, the power of poetry, and the self-reflexive impetus of the poem. You will have noticed the presence of the speaking I, the subject, the autobiographical subject, who then becomes the Akam poem, the intensity of one's own experience, how it sort of branches out or radiates out into more important social and public themes. Now, very often, one of the figures of speech that, or rhetorical devices that Ramanujan uses, is that of the enjambment, where one line is not closed, as it were, and another line begins. You will find this repeatedly in all his poems, so that the discontinuities of perception and experience are highlighted and foregrounded, and that the urgency of the next, the following associated emotion is brought in, or the associated object is brought in. I'll talk about these features, about irony and enjambment. I will talk about Ramanujan's Akam and Puram techniques once again, and I'll bring together and wrap together the themes of Ramanujan in my final and concluding discussion. And in my last real discussion with you, that is on Ramanujan, I intend to take the corpus of these 10 poems and through them take a broader look at what Ramanujan was bringing into Indian poetry in English, and how, Ramanujan exists somewhere in the liminal space between Indianness, modernities, and diasporic identities in his poems. It is with that, therefore, that I am bringing my recording of this lecture to a close. I think today's lecture covered a lot of things: philosophies, techniques, ways of looking, sight, and of course the usual themes in Ramanujan's poetry. I hope you will go back to this lecture. You will yourself take a look at the concept of banality of evil and Hannah Arendt's ideas, and I'll try and see how in Ramanujan, poetry forever moves in between the private and the public, the individual and the broader social. Right. It is with that, therefore, that I am stopping this particular moment of recording.